I suppose you want to know what was discussed, replied James, not responding to what Cleus had said to him. Instead he gestured towards the kitchen where the buffet that Lily had laid out was not quite completely demolished. Indeed. You got my flu? And I brought up every point, replied James evenly, watching as his colleague tucked into the leftovers. A part of him felt sorry for Cleus. No time to eat, little time for his nephew. It wasn't his fault that Septimus had been left in his care, and there were a lot of factors to be resolved in a short space of time. Hedgewoods, the reciprocator coordination, the conjurist threat. But then, there was so much that he had brought on himself, and Cleus Lupin was standing to gain a good deal of acclaim when he pulled it all off. Words that he would dearly liked to have said James Potter swallowed down into his throat. We had everybody, James continued, sitting down opposite Cleus. Benjamin Wergs, Bath Bradle. Even Arabella Figg and Daedalus Diggle managed it, though I think Daedalus might have been here to talk to you personally if you had given him another fortnight of 2 to 7 shifts. Cleus chuckled. He did ask. Cleus forked another couple of beef slices onto his plate. A comment about how he wouldn't be surprised if I put someone on a fortnight of graveyard shifts next. We are short-staffed, after all. Silence fell, save the crunch of Branston pickle which was accompanying a section of beef. How are Sirius and Remus? Cleus spoke softly, his demeanor changing as if a child asking permission from a parent. James knew that Cleus hadn't been to see either of them in almost a week. The wizard took pity on the ex-werewolf. Still unconscious. Which is good news, I suppose. They haven't died. Snape is working on a cure for Remus as well as refining the lycanthropy one for Sirius. Although I've not spoken to him of late, according to Snape it will be more efficient if he takes into consideration Sirius's genetic makeup. Lipstick, that sort of thing? Joked James. Cleus looked up from a hard-boiled egg and frowned. Never mind. I was just about to give you the minutes of the meeting. He handed Cleus a piece of parchment drafted by the top-secret quill which, once finished its top-secret writing, it exploded, stopping it being enchanted and made to rewrite the words from its previous use. He watched as Cleus glanced over the main points. Considering what we are up against, they've done well, he nodded, handing the minutes back to James. I know that McMullen has been pleased with their backup. We've had more arrests and taken in almost 24 illegal half-breeds. So many. What will be done with them? Deported. To their native country. He shook his head, pushing away his dozen times cleared plate. It's controversial, especially considering what conjurists are saying about the equality of half-breeds. And I'm sorry to say, their cause is growing. Fools. Utter fools. James snapped. How stupid can some wizards be? Really? Would you really think that what they are saying makes any sense at all? It's ludicrous. We know that. And, as you know, governments are generally only in power to look after those who are incapable of making sensible decisions themselves. We've put the half-breed measures in place for all citizens of the country. But we have to be a little cautious. Too many regulations will only strengthen their cause, and their following too. And I have it under good authority that Albus Dumbledore himself led a coven meeting last night, somewhere on the Yorkshire Dales. And we are short-staffed, reiterated James, shaking his head. Even if the ministry had implemented changes, the combined government would have to have it ratified by the European Parliament. And so many European countries do not seem to think that conjurists are a problem. We are indeed perceived to be skeptical, concluded Cleus, getting to his feet. And our staffing issues are unlikely to be resolved in the short term. Not that I'm concerned about Tabitha Penright. She was last seen in the Department of Mysteries by Gregor, although she has been absent for many months now. And what of Henrietta? Have you heard from her? James followed him back into the living room. the fire crackling yellow, the default fire flame. Soon, he knew, Callias would go, leaving Septimus there and working all night before returning in the morning. So many pots to keep on the boil, Callias, he said to his colleagues silently. I expect she would like to know of Sirius, certainly. Lily owled her, replied James. But she's not replied. She will if it suits her, Callias said archly. But I shall make a point of memoing her in any case. He approached the hearth. Well, if there's nothing else, you can reach me in my office, James. Hardly, thought James as he watched the head of the reciprocator movement about to depart. Before leaving, however, he took a step back out and fixed James with an intense stare. I do thank you, and Lily too, for holding the fort here for so long. And my gratitude for taking in Septimus tonight. I'll collect him tomorrow, and I'll give him the news about his mother. I have to ask, said James, despite himself, you're not putting yourself under too much pressure, are you? We are more than happy to have Septimus, for longer than one night if necessary, but dash. Your concern is kind, nodded Callias. I do indeed have a lot on. We've had a dozen applications from non-wizards so far, so it looks as if we are going ahead with the proposed changes at Hedgewood's. James nodded. They knew this. It had been discussed that evening. Lily was working on the history curriculum and he had only the finishing touches to put on his report about practical adaptations to the school itself to cater for those students who would now be attending that auspicious wizarding school. Snape is organizing the staff, so very soon there will be little for me to have to do on that front. We still have the pamphlets to intercept and stem somehow. Lucius Malfoy is working on that one though. A hard-hitting advertising campaign, no doubt, said James wryly. There wasn't much that wizard did without television and newspaper advertising being involved somewhere. Moments later and Callias was sitting at his office desk. There were so many things for him to organize, sort out, confirm, act upon. But he was confident in what he had just said to James, that his involvement in non-wizard integration into Hedgewood's would soon be far less frontline. He looked at the letters on his desk, scanning the address. Would it be a letter of complaint? For every application from a non-wizard he had received at least 3 calling for Callias to be removed from office, telling him the integration policy was ludicrous or threatening to withdraw their son or daughter from the school. Perhaps it wouldn't matter if the roll were shorter in terms of wizards. Where would these parents send their children anyway? Durmstrang was considered too elitist by many, although several would choose the institute. And as Xpitons only accepted witches, some parents may have to look outside Europe for their sons. That's if they carried through with their threat. Callias sighed, opened the owl. The howl reverberated round the office for a good 10 minutes and was so loud Callias thought the security wizards might have felt the need to check on him. He looked at his desk again and tentatively opened the other letter. 13 applications now, and this one was from someone Callias believed he knew. Septimus would be pleased. Callias closed his eyes, grateful the feed at HQ. It couldn't take long to clear the pile on his desk and get his memos sent. And then he would be back at Grimmauld Place proposing a Hedgewood's shopping trip for Septimus. Before that though, he would be able to tell his nephew that his mum was alive. 88,888,888. I don't like that cough. Stumbling to a stop, Cecilia lay with her back on the grass, panting in the bright sunshine. It beat down on her face as she inhaled and exhaled stiffly. Cecilia closed her eyes. She had covered the rest of the Yorkshire Dales with these, stopping the next night 2 miles north of Sedgbeg. There were no people out here, no hamlets. No roads to follow, even. She coughed again, then swallowed. It was probably the exertion, or the pollen. She rarely suffered from hay fever, but then, she was rarely out in one of the hottest, brightest summers sleeping in the open. She didn't like that cough, or rather, her mother wouldn't have. When her mother was alive, When Cecilia was little, she and her sister Amy just had to breathe irregularly and they would have been dragged down to the doctors and have to sit there, knowing her mother would be demanding antibiotics the moment they were seen. Just a swallow and a clear of throat would result in a frown and tut, followed by, "I don't like that cough." Even now Cecilia disliked visiting doctors, but it hadn't prevented her from being so protective of Septimus. Remus had joked that he might as well drag his chair near the fireplace so he could summon a healer to their son when he coughed, for he knew full well that Cecilia would be demanding he flew sometime that night. She coughed again. This time it had cleared her throat. For now. At least she would be back with her son soon, back to civilization where she could buy some antihistamine, or tunes if it turned out to be a cold. Cecilia sat up. She was exactly where she knew she needed to be. So few skills, yet navigation was one of her best. Kneeling forward she scooped some cool, crystal clear spring water which, many miles south, would join the Loon and become Lancaster's main river. A handful of water molecules were diverted from their path and made their way down her esophagus. Relief, temporarily. She allowed her Evian bottle to be filled up as the stream gurgled and bubbled in the way that springs really ought to do in the middle of the summer, high up in a national park, and tried not to think of the natural additives which would probably have made their way into it. She would be back to the cottage soon, and treated water. Drinking deeply again, Cecilia sat back on her knees. She had choices to make, and not just about the direction she would go. North and she would be more isolated, at liberty, still able to spend the next 28 hours or so as a free woman before Cleus knew where she was. Raising her hand she wafted it around her, regardless of any annoying insects. It would take longer, she wouldn't get to the cottage until tomorrow evening. But there was far less opportunity to steal food and would have to spend another night under the stars. Not that it was too cold, but you could never depend on the weather staying as it was the day before. If she headed south she would be at Kendal by the evening and perhaps be able to get a hot shower and a bed for the night. She might be able to hitchhike and the path was well trodden and familiar. But there was far more chance of being intercepted by the ministry before she had reached the cottage. It was odds that she knew increased if Cecilia was in contact with more people. She couldn't risk it, not after all she had been through, galleon-sized blisters, sunburn, fatigue and unhygienic that she was. That was why she had chosen the route she had, after all. If Cecilia had wanted comfort she could have had the Durmstrang ship sail due west, then south at the Hebrides, weaving its way as it would have done, past the Isle of Man and to Whitehaven, for example. There, she could have strolled to Nick Smith and Tunks's house and asked for a lift. The easy way. The arrogant way. The way of telling the world that she was back and it didn't matter to her who thought she was up herself. Not the Cecilia way. Why do it easily when there's a more difficult method to try? Many people had wondered aloud while she was present why she would opt for complicated. The last one in a divisive way, scornfully and mocking. It was probably the last thing she really remembered Henrietta saying to her, well not to her, exactly, to the room in general at Grimwald Place, on that fateful night when she had her outburst. But no one had spoken for her, and it had been that barb which, even though she had decided to put it behind her, still stung. When, after all she had done and sacrificed, not just for her family, but for every single reciprocator, and not one of them defended her when she was most in need of it, she would be willing to forgive, to put it down to weakness of character of those present, but she would not forget. She would not forget to put herself and her family first. Getting to her feet, dressed in a ludicrous combination of jeans, t-shirt, a shirt, trainers, an oversized jumper she had found on a washing line in Northallerton along with socks which she had used as they were designed, on her feet, and another pair on her hands as makeshift mittens. She had misappropriated a woolen ski hat with Velcro up ear flaps from the holiday home, which had been most useful in the preceding nights, doubling as both head protection and a pillow, a pump bag, Also from the holiday home with a rabbit applique to it which she had used to carry her ill-gotten gains. She would put it right, Cecilia promised to the cloudless sky. Nothing I've taken would really harm anyone, and I'll put it right. She looked around her, swallowing down the bitterness that she had invoked, and made the image of her son appear behind her closed eyes. Septimus. "Mummy's coming, Septimus," she said softly. "I'll be with you soon." Allowing the yellow hot sun to win on its course to her eyes, she opened them and surveyed the landscape, thought for a moment, running her hand through her needed-to-be-washed hair, then took a step north. 88,888,888. It had been a long time since Septimus had been to Diagonui, but it hadn't changed in the least. Cobbled paving stones under his shoes told him he was elsewhere, not in a usual high street in Britain, where underfoot regular herringbone brickwork would be neatly laid and shop hoardings would be uniform in size and shape. Not that he went to the shops much anyway, but Mum still preferred to take him to town when he needed new clothes or shoes. Not that he liked it much either. He remembered complaining that he didn't want to be there with her, and on occasions had gone out of his way to be difficult. Shopping in Diagonui was different, not least because the reason for coming there was different. Callias was giving him the option to buy his school things there, what he would need at Hedgewood's if he chose to be there. They weren't buying anything as such, although he knew Callias would probably buy him something. He usually did, and it was usually the case of the more often he had left Septimus the bigger the gift. Septimus often didn't want to choose a toy or game when Callias prompted him. He would have preferred his Uncle K to be out with him on the hills and mountains bug hunting or just exploring, but he also didn't want to offend his uncle either. Callias had shown Septimus around every shop on the main alley, the shops which would provide him with everything he needed for Hedgewood's. Books, cauldron, he knew the list. He remembered when Sam had returned from his shopping trip in the summer before he went to Hedgewood's, and how excited the young wizard had been when he had returned to the Reciprocator headquarters. Septimus could only have been about 6 at the time, but he remembered Sam sweeping his arm around in an imitation of his father and exploding an urn on the top of the mantelpiece which shattered into several hundred pieces and about which his mother had never let him forget. Callias had been at pains to explain to Septimus that the trip did not mean he had assumed that Septimus would choose the British Wizarding School, more that he just wanted to give his nephew the fuller picture and as much information as he needed before making his decision. And it had been rather fun, too. Stanley Ander, the proprietor of the one shop, had nearly fallen over himself with delight when he realized the head of Wizard Affairs had brought his nephew into his humble establishment. Flourish had explained, rather apologetically to Callias, about the delay in the non-wizard texts that ought to have been made available in Flourish, and Flots though assured him that by the end of the week his supplier would have delivered what he needed. Callias had waved the bookseller's concerns away and said he understood the difficulty. The books had been commissioned less than a month before, so it was understandable that there might be delays. They had lunched at the Mended Cauldron, and Callias had enthused about his days at the school, how Septimus's father, Remus, had, within weeks of starting at the school, implored the headmaster to give his elder brother a chance, and how he was confident that Severus Snape would be able to help Callias, considering his potion-making skills. Septimus tried not to show he was bored, even though he had heard this story from his uncle for probably the 1000th time. He knew it word for word, even the part when Uncle K nudged him and said, "And then what did Snape say? Eh?" Septimus tried to look keen, and he sipped his lemonade before looking back at his uncle, hoping that an expression that was close to rapt enthusiasm would be enough. What did he say? It was always best to ask a couple of questions during a well-trodden anecdote. "Why," he said, "of course I can. Just give me a week off lessons and it's yours." And you know what? Old Dippet did. Callias grinned, nudging Septimus before draining his butter beer. "I'm sure I've told you all this before," he concluded before, noticing the waiting pixie, picked up his glass and leaned back as the magical winged creature laid down his plate of fish, peas and chips. Septimus leaned back too as the pixie laid a second plate of the same in front of him. "Thanks, Uncle K," said Septimus as he picked up his knife and fork. "This looks delicious. And I'm so glad you could take the time to show me round Diagonally." Callias nodded. He had already taken a bite of fish and he was chewing well. Septimus glanced wistfully at the door. To say he was not trying to coerce Septimus into choosing Hedgewards was pushing into the realms of reality. Of course his uncle wanted him to go Hedgewards. He had been designing the non-wizard curriculum, Septimus knew. But he also knew that his uncle knew his mother's wishes and knew that Septimus missed his mother. His mind drifted to the last conversation he had had with his mother. It was only for a short time to help someone out of a situation, she had explained. She was like that, his mother. Always ready to help other people, even sometimes putting their problem ahead of her own. "Your father thinks it is a good idea that I go to. Can I go to see Dad again soon?" Callias looked up from his din and smiled under his moustache at his nephew. "I just want to tell him about things. About the schools, about Julian, and lots of other things. I'm sure he can hear me." "I'm sure too," replied Callias, putting down his knife and clapping Septimus on the back. "I'm going there tomorrow daytime, but Can I come too?" "Not then, but you can on Wednesday. Tomorrow I've somewhere else to take you." The sentence sounded final and Septimus knew enough not to push his uncle. "I wanted to tell him I was choosing between Edgeford High and Hedgewards. I did think I might like to go to Durmstrang, not because of Mum," he added quickly, "but it's supposed to be a good school for magic, isn't it?" Callias nodded, but said nothing as he took a bite from a couple of chips that he had stabbed onto his fork. Which path to take? It was a decision which had been starting to haunt Septimus of late. "But is that all they'll teach you at Durmstrang?" asked Callias looking over the rim of his beer butter glass like his father often did, and Septimus knew that his uncle's question was more than just a question. "Well, there'll be magic. And who else will be at the school? Only wizards. They don't admit non-wizards, do they? Do you understand why Hedgewards will be accepting non-wizards?" Septimus frowned, before biting off a forkful of peas. He supposed it was so that non-wizards could see what wizards did, so they could get jobs in the ministry for example. He knew Hedgewards was a nice school, lovely grounds, open countryside, not unlike his home here, so he supposed it wasn't fair for wizards to keep all that to themselves. "It's good to share," Septimus said eventually. "And people, wizards and non-wizards, can learn about each other." His uncle smiled, and then nodded. "It's about understanding. Durmstrang's headmaster believes wizards won't flourish if they're not taught in school specifically for them. But look at you. You've learned magic, you went to a non-wizard primary school, and it's not as if this is new to you." Septimus nodded despite the nagging doubt in the back of his mind, which was that he wanted to learn. There were some children who had magic whose parents were non-magical. Some of them wanted to forget about magic, or aspire to their parents' non-magic careers. He had even heard, from Sam, of one poor boy whose father and mother had been so down on the whole idea of him doing magic that he had lost all his confidence in Charm Hour and spent every lesson thereafter in tears. Perhaps there was a place for a school for just magic after all. Maybe Septimus would have felt better about it all if he could talk to his mum and dad. Aberforth thought that it was best for wizards and moles to be together, but, until recently, the ministry were reluctant to consider it. But it helps that there is a reciprocator as headmaster. Professor Snape, thought Septimus, considering that looming wizard. "Do you remember any of the shops here in Diagonally?" Callias looked through the dirty, cobweb-strewn cauldron window, the glimmering lights of a shop selling animals shining through. "It must have been about 5 years ago since you were last here." Septimus nodded a little but looked down at his half-eaten lunch. He remembered why he hadn't thought much about this wizardly commercial thoroughfare for such a long time. His mother had been upset, even though Dad had thought it had been a good joke. Septimus had hidden in Flourish and Flots, lying under a cloth-covered table so he couldn't be seen in order to continue to read the latest comic about Finn McCool the Giant, his favorite Marvelous Comics character. He remembered his parents' voices getting louder and louder as he sat under the table. 3 hours later, long after he had read the still Flourish and Flots comic, a time when panic and fear had set in, no one had found him, and Septimus had known, even at 6, that if he left the shop there was even less chance of them finding him. "You were young, and children hide," qualified Cleus in highly perceptive manner, to which Septimus was now used. "That's what your dad was telling your mum." But Mum hadn't been angry with him for hiding. He remembered, she'd been shouting at Dad for letting him out of his sight while she had been shopping for work robes in Madame Imonis's shop, something which he, and the rest of the bookshop, now knew that she had loathed doing, and further, had to go to Diagonally, somewhere she loathed going. And after all of his mum's shouting, he remembered Dad laughing at her. Does she love Dad? Septimus didn't voice the question, nor did anyone answer it. Yet an answer appeared in his mind. Regardless. She does, in her own way. "By the way," said Septimus, "I forgot to tell you there was a message in the hearth from someone, a woman. I think she appeared before, but didn't say anything." The connection seemed very bad. "She said her name is Miss Granger. Is she your girlfriend?" "She works in the ministry," replied Cleus, laughing heartily. "What did she have to say?" "She said something about a veil. I thought she was talking about getting married, or something. And she also said," Septimus broke off, the question which had been plaguing Septimus all day, which had been willing him out of shops, making him feel like what his mum must have done when she had been looking for him when he was younger, now burst out of him. "Please, uncle, please tell me where my mother is." "If I knew, I would," Septimus, replied Cleus, putting down his fork and patting Septimus on the back. "I was going to tell you this evening, but I'm glad you brought it up." He smiled at his nephew reassuringly. "What I meant to say was, I don't know exactly where she is, but she is in Britain somewhere." Septimus's eyes widened. He wanted to ask more questions but knew that he didn't want to chance on the fact that some of the answers he might not want to hear. "Septimus, tomorrow I've got to go to Hedgewoods. I wonder whether you would like to come with me to see what the school is like?" Septimus thought for a moment, trying to banish the bubbling thoughts of his mother, now, seemingly, at least, alive. "Yes, that would be nice, Uncle K," Septimus replied, eating a few more chips, his mind as far from Hedgewood's School of Witchcraft and Wizardry as it could probably be. Not as nice as those which Mum used to get for them as a treat, but nice enough. Even nicer now knowing that he could at least see her soon. 10 minutes later, a pair of clean plates and the bill settled. Septimus followed Cleus out of the mended cauldron. "Mum. Missing still, yes, but not dead. To the animalarium. How about your own owl, Septimus?" Septimus said nothing, and the rest of the afternoon, the purchasing of a baby tawny owl, their departure home and tea passing very much as an automated blur. Mum was not gone. She was alive. And she was coming home to him.